One of the biggest advantages of Capture One is that we can actually customize pretty much everything. So let's see how we can use that to our advantage and make our workflow a lot more efficient. So we are now back with the session we used in the beginning, and we're going to see how we can customize our workspace. So the workspace is basically everything that we've got on screen. So on the left, we've got our different tools placed in different tabs. In the middle, we have the viewer, and on the right, we've got the browser to browse through the different pictures. On the top, we've got different tools as well, which we will be able to customize just like the tools, the pen, and the browser. So to customize it, it's extremely simple. You just right-click wherever you want to change something. So for example, if we want in the exposure tab to add a tool, so for example, if you want to add the white balance, we just right-click, add tool, then go find the tool we want to add, and then add it there. So by default, it should come at the end of all the listed tools, and then we can click and drag it to put it in place wherever we want. The goal here is really to design an interface that helps you work faster and not an interface that will get into the way of editing your pictures. So try to keep only the tools that you really need and remove everything else. So here, for example, I don't use Instagram quite often, so click on the three dots and remove tool. So that way I can clean up the interface and keep only what I really need and what I really use. Vignetting, I don't use it either, so I'm going to remove it as well. I don't use levels that much, so let's remove it and I'll bring it back if I need. And here we go, we've got a pretty simple exposure tab with just the bare minimum. If you are a Lightroom user and slowly switching to Capture One, you may like to get your browser at the top of the screen instead of on the right. So to change that, you can simply go to View and then find Browser and Customize Browser, and here you can click Place below. Now you've got your browser at the bottom of the screen instead of on the right, and it's easy to make it disappear or just appear. So you can either go back to View and click on Browser to hide it, or just use the shortcut, which is Command plus B or Control plus B. So here, and it's back. And if I want to place it on the right, I can use shortcut as well. So Command plus Shift plus B, and it goes back to the right of my screen. If you want to customize the top toolbar, just like before in the tab, you can right-click on it and then Customize Toolbar. Here you've got a new window which is opening up, and you can either drag in or drag out icons. So if you want to add the copy and apply tool, you can simply click on it and drag it to the toolbar where you may need it. And then if you want to take off something, you just click on it and remove it. So for example, we don't want the exposure warnings, so let's click on it and drag it out. And just like that, it disappears from the toolbar. Once you're done customizing it, you just click on Done, and Capture One will save the interface. Workspaces can be saved so that if you are editing something different, you can adapt the workspace to whatever you are currently editing. So for example, I've created different workspaces for whenever I'm editing weddings, or if I'm editing beauty, or if I'm shooting tethered. So that way I get only the tools that I really need when I'm editing either beauty, wedding, or shooting tethered. Capture One makes it extremely easy to save workspaces by simply going to Window, then Workspace, and then you can click on Save Workspace. Before we click on Save Workspace, as you can notice here, you've got a couple of saved workspaces that are available by default. So the default one is the workspace we've used so far. Simplified is the same, but with fewer tools. Then Simplified for import, edit, export, tethered capture, black and white editing. So black and white is especially useful if you are going to edit only black and white pictures, so that then you get access only to the tools that are useful when editing black and white. The migration workspace, which is the next one, is designed for people that are transitioning from Lightroom to Capture One. So the interface is extremely similar to what you are used in Lightroom. Then the dual monitor workspaces are two workspaces meant to help you work on two screens. And the The last two are actually custom workspaces that I've created for my editing. So let's click on Save Workspace, and here we can simply give it a name. So for example, tutorial as a demo, let's press Save. And now if I go back to Window, Workspace, I'll find Tutorial. So if I click on it, it won't do anything because it's actually the workspace I'm currently using. But if I were to move to the default and then come back to the tutorial, I'd see a difference. So let's do that. So if I click on default, that's the interface you get when you start Capture One for the first time. And if we go back to Window, Workspace, and then Tutorial, now I should have the same interface as I had before. The default workspace is great because you will get access to most of the interesting tools of Capture One. But if you want to access everything, or if you want to really customize it to save time, then I'd say it's a great idea to start by customizing your workspace before you get to work with Capture One. Another trick that you can use to improve your efficiency in Capture One is to customize your keyboard shortcuts. So let's see how we can customize them. We've already talked about it a bit earlier in the tutorial, but let's see how far we can go with it. So if we go to Edit and then Edit Keyboard Shortcuts, we can now access all the different keyboard shortcuts that are available in Capture One. So before customizing it, let's create a new set of keyboard shortcuts. To create a new set, let's click on plus and then give it a name. So for example, here I'm going to call that F-stoppers and then click OK. So here I have a new set which contains all the default shortcuts, but I can customize it so that it matches exactly what I want. So to customize a feature, you can either go by name and try to find it. So for example, if I want to change how I can adjust exposure, I can try and find where the exposure shortcut is. So let's go to Other, Exposure, and here you've got the two shortcuts, so one to increase exposure and the other one to decrease exposure. So by default, it's Control plus Command plus plus, which is probably not extremely practical. I've personally set the exposure adjustment to arrows, so up for increase exposure and down to decrease the exposure. I've used that so that I can then do the same with the brightness, so I'll just add Alt in the shortcut, so Alt plus up arrow to increase the brightness and Alt and down arrow to decrease the brightness. Now if I close that window, it has saved everything, and now if I click on the up arrow, it will increase the exposure, and if I press down, it will decrease it. If I press Alt and up arrow, it will change the brightness, and with the down arrow, it will simply decrease the brightness. By changing keyboard shortcuts, you will make Capture One much easier to use because then you don't have to remember what the default shortcuts are, but instead you will just create your own, and then the interface is really the one that you need to edit and not some interface that you need to adapt to. Another thing with the keyboard shortcuts, if we go back to Edit and Edit Keyboard Shortcuts, you can also find the keyboard shortcut by simply typing whatever feature you're looking for. So let's say I want to find the saturation slider. I can simply type in saturation, and here I can find either the saturation in the exposure tool or the saturation of the different wheels of the color balance tool. If I were to look for how to capture or trigger the camera, let's try capture. And here by default it's Command plus K. Now if you're looking for a specific key to see whatever it triggers, so let's say I want to see what keyboard shortcuts are using the key C, so let's press C on my keyboard, and now I can see it's used in the edit menu to copy, or copy adjustment by using Shift with Command plus C, or to crop if I just press on C. So if I want to use a letter but just make sure it's not used already, I can simply click on key and then enter whatever letter I'm looking for. If you want to print a sheet containing all the different shortcuts you have, just click on Summarize, and it's in different categories so that it's easier to read. When we shot Tethered, we actually customized the session to add different folders because by default we only get one capture folder, but we saw that it was interesting to get a pre-light folder and one to shoot one look, or if we had numerous look, we could create additional folders. So let's see now how we can actually create templates out of the session we created the other day so that you can save time the next time you have a similar shoot. So let's go to the library tab and then library and change the session. So I'm going to go back to the session we used to shoot tethered, and so that we've got the different folders we've created. So here we still have the look one and the pre-light. If I want to create a new session template, I can simply go to File and then find the Save As template. When you click on Save As template, it will open up the proper folder, so you don't actually need to go find the proper folder to save your template in. So let's just give it a name. So let's say pre-light plus one look and click Save. Now, if I come here to File and create a new session, let's call it Demo. It's just to show you how you can use templates. So let's call it Demo and then Template, and we've got different templates. So the for looks, it's one that I've already created that I use a lot. And pre-light plus one look, if I click on it and press OK, as you can see before we press OK, we've lost all the details about capture, selects, and trash folder. That's just because we've defined it in the template. So let's press OK, and now we've got a new session. We still have the favorites we had in the previous session, and if I go to capture folder, right click, show in library, we still have capture plus look one plus pre-light in the capture folder. So it's exactly the same structure as we had for the tethered shoot. If we had created session albums, they would be included in the session template, and they would be available here as well after we created a new session. Now let's talk about styles. Styles are a great way to try different looks very quickly or to apply the same settings over different pictures. So let's see how we can create different styles or how we can apply a style to a picture. So styles are found in the default workspace just after the loop, so just after the detail tab. In the styles and preset tool, you will find different sections. So the first one is the user styles. So that's any style you've bought and imported in Capture One or styles that you've created. Then the built-in styles are the styles that are available by default when downloading Capture One for the first time. So you should find the IQ style, Legacy, and Spring ones. Then user presets are presets that you are going to create for specific tools. So it's kind of like a style, but just for one tool and not multiple tools at once. Then built-in presets are presets that are available by default in Capture One when you download it. So let's go back to the user styles, which is what's interesting for us today, or even the built-in style as well. So for example, here, if we want to try different styles, let's open up the Spring, which you should have as well on your computer. And now if you hover the different styles, you'll see a different look each time that you go to a different style. So you can just try that. For example, if I like this one, I could either click on it to apply it, or I can also apply it as a layer. To apply it as a layer, you just right-click on the style, and then instead of apply to background, just apply to a new layer. If the picture has already different layers and you have one selected, then you can even apply to the selected layer, which is now grayed out on my screen. So let's go ahead and apply to a new layer. If I do that, now if I go back to my exposure tab, in the layers tool, you'll find a new layer which has the name of the style. What's great about style and applying them as a layer is that now I can tweak it by simply adjust the opacity or just go ahead and try different things in different tools. So for example here, let's find out what it has changed to my image. So it has changed the high dynamic range tool, so highlight is higher and shadow as well. So if I want to bring back even more details from shadows, I can change that. And if I want to adjust the color, let's go back to the color tab and see if it has done anything. So here in the color balance, as you can see, it has added some cyan in the shadows and some yellow or orange in the midtones. So if I want to have more cyan in the shadows, I can simply tweak that. And now I think that's great. So if the look is too strong, let's lower the opacity, and here we go. Now that's how you apply a style when you use one that's already created. But let's see how we can create our own and how we can apply it to a different picture. So if I go to a different picture, let's say this one, and I simply want to create a new color look. So let's say I want something that's a bit more moody. So I'm first going to start by removing the burn layer so I can really see what I have on the background layer. So let's add some blue or cyan in the shadows, some cyan in the midtones, and then I'm gonna add some more cyan in the highlight to have something that's really cold. Then I'm going to adjust the saturation of each of the channels, and here, and the shadows as well. Let's darken the shadows as well. So by using the color balance, you can actually also tweak the luminosity of each luminosity area. So let's say I want my shadows to be darker. I'm just going to bring that slider down. I'm going to make my midtones darker as well, and then add some luminosity to my highlights to get more contrast. So here we go. And now let's move back to the exposure tab and just remove some of the saturation here. And let's play around with curves to tweak even more our colors. So I want less red in the shadows, perhaps a bit more in the highlights. That's just so that I keep a bit more of a real skin tone instead of something that looks too blue or green. So now let's move to green, add some green in the highlights, some magenta in the shadows, and now it's starting to look much better. Now let's add some blues in the shadows, add some yellows in the highlights. That's perhaps a bit strong, and let's remove some blue here and remove even more red in the first red channel. So there we go, and now let's play around with the RGB curve just to tweak the luminosity a bit. So I'll darken the shadows and try to brighten just the highlights. So S curve, that's probably too strong, so let's rise the midtones a bit. And now it's a bit too saturated, so I'm going to desaturate even more. Okay, so now if you want to save this as a style, let's move back to the Styles and Preset tab, and we'll have a new option here. We can go to the three dots, click on it, and click Save as User Style. We are given the choice to pick whatever tools we want to include in the style. So let's say I don't want to change the color editor at all. I can just untick skin tone here. Then let's click Save, but before that, just one more word. If you have exposure or white balance changed on your picture, just be sure to untick that if you don't want the change to be included in the style. It's usually not a good practice to keep white balance and exposure in the style. So now let's press Save. It should go in the proper folder on your computer. So let's call that Demo and F-stoppers and press Save. Now if I go back to my user styles, I'll find a new Demo F-stoppers style, which I can apply to any of my pictures. So let's go back to another picture and see how this one looks. So if I were to apply, that's how my picture would look. Let's right click, apply to new layer, and then go back to exposure. And now if I want to adjust the opacity, I can simply bring back my opacity. And here we go. So before the style and with the style. When shooting a lot of pictures, it's always great to have a couple of tips just to go a bit faster when culling them. So let's see a few ways that you can make your culling just that much faster by using Capture One. The first tip is actually hidden in Capture One. So let's go up to the toolbar, right click on it, and then Customize Toolbar. When customizing, we've got new options that we didn't have before because not all tools are enabled by default. One of them that I love to use when culling picture is called Focus Mask. So let's click on it and bring it to the toolbar and drag and drop. Now let's click Done, and now we've got access to a new feature, which is a Focus Mask. So let's click on it and see what it does. As you can see now, we've got a green mask on both the picture in the viewer as well as those in the browser. So the green mask is simply to indicate what area is actually in focus on the picture. So let's click, for example, on the third picture here and see what Capture One says should be actually in focus. So here, in this case, it's telling us it should be more the skin rather than the eye, and it seems to be actually true. So when calling a lot of images, that's going to make our work a lot faster and easier, because then we don't actually need to zoom in the picture. We can simply look at them by using the browser. So here, if I press Alt plus Command plus V, the viewer just disappeared and I'm left with my browser, so I can quickly see which pictures are sharp or not. If you want to adjust the mask, you can go to Capture One, Preferences, and then in Focus, you will be able to adjust the threshold, the opacity, and the color of the mask as well. When you change the color, just make sure that you don't take and use the same color as you used for the mask for the layers. For example, earlier in the tutorial, we changed the mask color for the layers to green, and now if we were to enable both masks, it would then be hard to see the difference between them. So let's go back to Appearance and click on the mask color for layers, and let's reset it to red. And now it's going to be a lot easier to see which mask is what. So let's go back to Focus here and try to adjust the threshold to see how it actually affects the picture. So as you can see, the higher you bring it, the less green you have. That's just because then Capture One will try to find the exact place where the focus is. So if you try a smaller value, then you will have a lot more green, and Capture One will be less picky about where the focus is. So now we can close that and talk about the other feature that helps when culling. The other feature will help you see which pictures are over or underexposed. So let's see where we can find that tool and how we can use it to our advantage. So by default, you should actually find it here in the top toolbar, but earlier when I talked about workspaces, I actually removed it. So let's bring it back up. So right click on the toolbar, Customize, and then let's bring it, and it's just next to the focus mask. So it's called Exposure Warnings. I'm going to drag it and drop it on my toolbar. Let's click on Done. And now I'm going to disable the focus mask to see better the exposure warnings. And if you click on exposure warnings, you can see what areas are overexposed as they are displayed in red, and which ones are under as they are shown in blue. Here I don't have anything in blue, and by default, usually Capture One has that feature disabled. So if you want to enable it, let's go back to the preferences, so Capture One 12, preferences, and then let's move to exposure. In exposure, we have different options. So the first one is the color of our highlight. So as I said before, here anything that is overexposed is going to show red, and it's actually anything that goes over 250 on the scale from 0 to 255. If you want to see the areas that are blocked up in the shadows, just click on Enable Shadow Warning, and then you can either leave the slider to the default value, which is 0, or move it higher if you want to see shadows that are, for example, below 5, because you don't want any value to be between 0 and 5. When we went over the exporting process, we talked quickly about annotations and overlays. So I think it's now time that we see how those tools work. So let's start with the annotation and see why it's extremely useful, especially when you're working with a retoucher or if you are doing your own retouching in Photoshop. So the annotation tool is found in the metadata tab, so let's go there, and it should be right at the top. So let's close the other tools and just keep the annotations. We could even actually bring the annotation tool in by snapping it out of the toolbar and pressing Command plus T or Control plus T to simply close the toolbar so that we can maximize the screen space. The annotations are extremely easy to use, so you don't have to remember a lot here. You simply can draw or erase an annotation and give it a color. So let's say I want to remember to Photoshop something out, so let's click on the Draw tool and then pick a color. So let's say red for anything that has to be cloned out. And then I can go on my picture and simply circle it so that then when I go into Photoshop, I'll have a layer with the annotations, and I can see what I had marked in Capture One. So if you are working with a retoucher, it helps a lot, so that then you don't have to go through a lot of explanations, but simply send your picture with the layer and you can quickly see what you want to be retouched. The eraser tool in the annotation tool is extremely easy to use because actually if you click on it, it won't erase like the eraser in Photoshop, but if you click here on any annotation, it will simply remove it fully. So you don't need to be extremely precise. You just hover it, click, and then it will take out the annotation. So you don't need to go over for a few seconds. It's just one click. The other tool we also talked about when shooting tethered was the overlay. So let's see how we can use overlay to either help us frame a shot or even actually help you create a composite. The overlay tool is found in the Capture tab. So let's go back to the second tab, which is the Capture One, and then all the way down to the small tool called Overlay. So I'm going to bring it out just like before, Command or Control+T to close the tool tab. And now I'm left with just the viewer, the tool that I'm going to use, and the browser on the right. So I'm going to drag a picture here just to show you how the overlay works so that we can work with one and see how it actually applies on the picture. So let's go back to my Finder, drag and drop on the drop image here. And now it doesn't do anything. That's just because we need to enable the overlay. So let's click on Show, and now we've got a new overlay displayed over the picture. So if you're going to shoot for a magazine, for example, it's great because then you can ask for the layout if they've got one and then simply apply it as an overlay and see if your picture will match and fit their layout. If you're going to shoot still life, it's great as well. I've used it a few times if I, for example, bumped my tripod and needed to make sure that my composition was still the same. So I would drag the last shot, so even if it's a RAW, it will work. In this case here, I used a PNG just to get the full transparency, but you can use a PSD, a TIFF, a JPEG, or whatever other files that you would like to use. The overlay tool also has different options, so you can move around the overlay. So for example, if you don't want to show it in full opacity, you can just turn down the opacity. For example, here, let's turn it down to around 50. If it's not scaled properly, you can scale it as well. So by default, it's at 100%, but you can stretch it or try to reduce it depending on what you need. And then you can also move it around by using the horizontal and vertical sliders. So the horizontal, if you push it to the right, the overlay will move to the right. And same with vertical, if you move it right, it will move it down, and if you move it left, it will move up. So double click to reset, and here we go. So let's bring the opacity back up, and now if we were on set, I could show that to the magazine or client or whoever is on set, and just make sure that everything is however they'd like it to be.